More importantly than anything else, I think it's a day when we are reminded for one day in the entire calendar year that the world is divided into classes, that it is divided into those who live by wealth and those who live by work, those who own the vast riches of the society that we live in, and those who must work for them to survive. And there is a vast conspiracy to deny that basic truth of the world that we live in, a conspiracy that runs through the education system and the mass media, and it runs through our workplaces. We see it every day to try to tell us that this is not the case, that we live in some world where there is a far greater degree of nuance than that simple division between those who own and those who must work for them. And yet that division runs through every facet of our lives, from where we live and who owns it and who must pay rent for it, from where we work and who owns that place and who must work for them, where we buy our food, who owns that, who produces that food, the transport that we take. Every part of our life from the beginning, when we are born until we die, that truth remains present. And I think to have a day when we remember that is very important. And it also reminds us that when we are dealing with the problems in our lives, that division remains in place. These are not problems that exist in some just purely abstract sense or objective sense. They are problems that are class problems. When we look at the cost of living crisis, we don't just look at a crisis, we look at a class war. And we can see that division once again when we look at energy bills rising for £1,500 a year for working people this year, as against record profits for the major energy corporations. When we see taxes being raised on working class people through national insurance increases, at the same time as we see no taxes on wealth that are being increased and no taxes on major corporations being imposed. At the same time as we hear all of this panic about workers wanting more wages, the government and the establishment and the ruling class are perfectly happy to allow inflation, real inflation, of about 9 or 10% in the prices that people must pay for the things they need to survive. That doesn't produce panicked responses from the Bank of England. But the second workers begin to ask for increased wages, well, then we're told we need wage restraint. And it can often seem like, in the context of that vast conspiracy that I was talking about, that this is a class war in which only one side is fighting. But that is not the case. That is not the case. One side, of course, has vastly more power. One side owns the media environment, and it owns the big businesses, and it owns the political parties, to be totally frank. And the other side doesn't. But the other side does fight. And I want to pay tribute to some of those who are fighting right now on the side of working people on their own side, but also on the side of a class that's struggling for decency and dignity in work and in life. We organized an event this week for the Churchill cleaners who are fighting for a living wage in the southeast and in the trains, and I want to pay tribute to them. I want to pay tribute to the CHEP workers who have just fought and won the longest strike in Unite Trade Union's history up in Manchester. I want to pay tribute to those who are balloting for strike action now as well. The campaigns that are being organised in Mitties, a vitally important campaign, the campaign of the BT workers and the Communication Workers Union, which would be, if they win their ballot, and we hope that they do, the largest call centre strike in the history of British trade unionism, with thousands of workers involved in that strike. I want to pay tribute to those who are organising to ballot on the rail, where we have thousands of workers balloting for strike action in what would be one of the biggest rail strikes since the general strike. 15 companies and Network Rail involved in that one. Anyone who has been involved in the left will remember, I would say, in fact, far beyond that, but we would remember with a certain degree of bitterness the narrative around key workers during the COVID pandemic, where we were told in these patronizing terms about the importance of workers who were putting their lives and their health and the health of their families at risk in the middle of a global health crisis. We were told that their work was essential, and it was. But we were also told that, they must be satisfied with a clap. They must be satisfied with the kind words of a government. I think it is worth remembering just how many of the workers that we're talking about when I listed those strikes are these key workers, people who had to put themselves at the front line in the middle of the pandemic. The cleaners, the BT engineers, the people who kept our trains going. These people and the NHS workers who have been denied a pay rise despite all of the claps from Boris Johnson and despite all of the candied words of the political elite. These were the people who we were reminded during that pandemic really kept society going. Not the ones who own all the wealth, not the ones who occupy the City of London, the people who every day do the small jobs that keep society ticking over, every day do the work that is necessary to allow other people to live their lives instead of doing the work to exploit people as they live their lives. And these are the ones who now, despite all of that rhetoric, have to fight for dignity at work on the picket line. Our job, in my view, on the left is to organize that resistance, to remind people that any given strike is not just the battle for one set of workers and their workplace, but it is part of a broader struggle for justice in our economy and over the question of who owns and who runs our society. Our job on the left is to bring all of those individual streams together into a mighty river that can break the dam of the ruling elite and the property class, and that can, in its way, give life to a different kind of economy and different society.
Ronan, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up in a minute, if that's okay.
Yes,
sorry.
No problem. I will come to my conclusion now. My final word is just to say, as well as thanking all of those who were on this call and all those listening in, that we have opportunity to support those strikes and also to come together in that way on June 18th at the Trade Union Congress demonstration, where we have to go and make our voices heard and be present on the streets fighting for that different kind of society. Thank you, Daisy.
Thank you very much, Ronan. So at the moment, the fight against nuclear weapons could not be more important. And next, I'm delighted to announce that we're going to be joined by Kate Hudson, the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament.
Thanks very much, Daisy, and May Day greetings to everyone from CND. We're living in hugely dangerous times. The two great existential threats of climate catastrophe and nuclear war are accelerating wildly, yet every day more is done to make matters worse, not better. And I believe that we need to understand that we're at a turning point for humanity. We can either pull back and do things very differently, or we can carry on as we're doing now and face annihilation. And not recognizing that is to have our heads in the sand and to sleepwalk into disaster. None of the massive problems that we face can be resolved by business as usual, and ignoring them is just plain reckless. And this is one of those times when in the future, if we have one, people will look back and say, but why didn't they do something? The prospect of nuclear war is closer than it ever has been. And although there's plenty of talk in the media about World War III and nuclear weapons use, the actions that are leading us to that disaster continue unabated. In fact, our government is not just ignoring the threats, it's actively making the situation worse. Through its gung-ho inflammatory rhetoric, its refusal to negotiate, and its military escalation, which of course is a bonanza for the arms companies. But unfortunately, it's not just the government, but others too, that are calling for more militarization, for escalation of the war, as if this is going to bring peace to the region. And the refusal to recognize the role that Western policy has played in creating this situation, namely the expansion of NATO into the region over 30 years, is deeply shocking. Silencing those who do understand the dynamics of world politics is anti-democratic and ahistorical. How can you solve a problem if you refuse to address all the factors that have created it? There can be no military solution to this conflict. Negotiation which resolves all its complex aspects is essential. And thinking that this is a good time to take Russia down, which seems to be the latest crazy talk out there, will not only lead to a massive death toll of young Ukrainian and Russian soldiers, but will be a fast track to nuclear war. But it's not just the Ukraine war that is increasing the nuclear threat. Last year, the British government announced a nuclear arsenal increase of over 40%, while it claimed that there was no money for a decent pay rise for nurses. This is a massive waste of our resources that actually puts us at greater risk. Don't fall for the old lie that nuclear weapons make us safe. They just make us a target. Last week, we heard the bizarre statement from Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. He said that he was grateful that we have nuclear weapons in case Britain needs to be protected. So he clearly doesn't understand how nuclear weapons work. They don't protect us. They don't stop nuclear warheads coming in. They are not a shield. They just make it more likely that we will suffer from nuclear attack. And what the government is currently refusing to comment on is the reports that US nuclear weapons are being brought back to Britain, to RAF Lakenheath in Suffolk. This is a big nuclear escalation, and we need to strongly reject it. So if you can, please join us at Lakenheath on Saturday, the 21st of May, to say no to this latest escalatory development. What we need, before it is too late, is for our movement to get organised and to strengthen our long-standing principles, peace, unity and socialism, and all tribute to those who are standing firm for these values. Echoing the war cries of the government and its NATO-led agenda, backing nuclear weapons, supporting the killing of ordinary people by ordinary people in a foreign land, have no part in the proud history and values of our labour movement. It's time for us to stand up and unite in international solidarity against war, against nuclear weapons, with courage and determination. Not to do so is to wave goodbye, not only to the self-respect of our movement, but the very future of humanity. Now is the time to state clearly as a movement that the cause of peace is the hope of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kate. That's fantastic. So we are now moving on to some of our international speakers. So we're going to be starting with Nathália Urban, a Brazilian journalist and a contributor to Brazil Wire. Massive resistance has been building in Brazil to the far-right President Bolsonaro, and we stand with that great resistance and the left in social movements in Brazil. And of course, hope for Lula's return to president later in the year. So thank you, Nathália.
Hi, thank you so much for having me here. I know everybody wants to talk about the future. We want to talk about the prospects of having Lula as a president again. But in honor of May Day, I want to talk about the situation, the current situation of the Brazilian working class. We are talking about outsourcing, Uberization, and the dismantling of our labor laws that have been conquered in the 20th century. We are seeing Brazil with almost 14 million unemployed people, according to the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics. For those who still have some income, informality has been the way. About 34 million Brazilian workers, almost 40% of Brazil's economically active population, are in the informal sector. It's the people who work the everyday, the day laborers, street vendors, people who work as freelancers, among others. During Bolsonaro's presidency, we see a lot of the dismantling being ongoing, but we have to remember that we are talking not just about Bolsonaro, but we are talking about a project that has started after Dilma Rousseff's coup, with Michel Temer destroying our most precious labor laws with the reformation of those laws. Now we are seeing a huge setback with Bolsonaro, with the suspension of employment contracts for up to 4 months, the postponement of the payment of the guarantee funds, and the reduction of wages by 70%. In 2020, with similar decision of Bolsonaro, 1.5 million people had their salaries reduced and 9.8 million had their work contracts suspended. We are seeing a tripod of horrors regarding workers in Brazil. The precariousness can be expressed by the outsourcing of work through the companies that unpaid workers are also underpaid those workers, the Uberization, the gig economy. We are seeing, even though now we are seeing a huge amount of mobilization through the new unions formed by those users of apps, we are also seeing that they have facing the most difficult challenges, especially through the pandemic, where they were like the base of the Brazilian society, doing deliveries, making the economy afloat. And we are also seeing the dismantling of the most precious rights that Brazilians have given their lives to achieve. The reality for workers in Brazil is that even more perverse in the context with a significant contingent of workers who have never experienced social rights or labor rights, especially in Brazil, especially in the countryside. We are seeing also a huge number of people dying out of land grabbing, workers being forced into slave labor, basically through greedy plantation owners. And nothing has been done because those people want to continue to explore the most marginalized people of the Brazilian society. And that's why the international community needs to unite to support Lula's re-election as our president again. We need to support the downfall of Bolsonaro, but not only this, we need to support taking those who destroyed the Brazilian democracy, who supported the ascension of Bolsonaro into justice. We need to have Bolsonaro in The Hague, paying for everything that he has done against the workers in Brazil, against the workers in Latin America. We have to make the people who removed Dilma from power, not just from Brazil, but from abroad, paid for what they have done with the Brazilian people. We are talking over more than 500,000 Brazilians died through COVID. Other millions are dying every day through the increased cost of living and the lack of basic support to be able to live in the country that they have given their life to work and contribute with a functioning society. We have to stop the exploitation of workers, not just in the UK, not just in Europe, but all over, including in my homeland, Brazil. So have a great May Day, everybody, and muito obrigada for having me here today, sorry.
Thank you very much, Nathália. I also just want to say thank you very much to everyone participating in the Q&A box at the moment. So there's lots of people sharing really, really interesting thoughts and questions about May Day and about what's going on at the moment. So please do check out the Q&A box to see everyone's contributions there as well. So it's not only in Brazil that people are currently resisting and defeating the far right. So next we have got Varsha Gandikota of Progressive International, who's going to update us on the heroic struggle of Indian farmers and their victories against the Modi government.
Hi, everyone. Many greetings to all of you from Hyderabad, India. I'm Varsha Gandikota, coordinator of the Progressive International. It's a difficult May-Day for workers across the world and really for all progressive forces as we claw our way out of the 2 years of devastating effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. It's an especially grim time here in India where relentless assault on labor rights has been coupled with an assault on all forms of civil liberties and dissent, with journalists and activists locked up in prison without due process and an injection really of hate and violence against minorities that's eating into the very soul of Indian society. So I want to tell you one story here today. Minorities have, of course, been under brutal assault. We've seen open calls for abduction and rape of Muslim women, mob lynchings of men offering prayers on the streets, interfaith relationships not just being ostracized, but outlawed in certain states. And the perpetrators of these kind of violence, the impunity that they enjoy. Last week in Delhi, municipal authorities, in a completely illegal move, destroyed homes and shops, majority of them belonging to Muslims in a neighborhood called Jahangirpuri, under the pretext of an anti-encroachment drive where bulldozers razed their homes and livelihoods to the ground. Against this background, Boris Johnson visits India one day after this incident. Not only does he not bring up absolutely anything about the genocidal attempt by the Modi government, but goes to Modi's home state, Gujarat. And what does he do? He does a photo op at a bulldozer factory of him sitting on one, precisely the same vehicle that was used to destroy the livelihoods of these Muslim families. I say this to say this, we of course know that there's enough and more evidence that the right-wing international is thriving, whether you look at Boris Johnson and Modi in India, or Erdogan in Turkey, and so on and so forth. So in the face of these transnationally coordinated attacks, and in the face of planetary crises like climate that others have talked about, the central project, I think, for us as socialists can only be one of socialist internationalism. But if you're serious about that, and not just as rhetoric, not just as, all our struggles are interconnected and all that, but as practice, which has to be based in a serious investigation of the global economy, then any socialist demand, it seems to me, any socialist demand in the UK, whether it's, the complete nationalization of the NHS, increased funding for public schooling, green transport, elimination of hunger. If you're serious about internationalism, you have to ask, where's the money for these projects coming from? That money is coming to the UK from payments on debt paid by the poorest countries, not only to the UK government, but to big banks in London, like the Anglo firm Glencore that has doubled its share of lower income government debt, for instance, in the last decade, and refused to cancel any debt payments even during the pandemic. That money is coming from B&E Systems, the British arms and aerospace company that has sold something like $17 billion worth of weaponry to the Saudis during the Yemen war. You look at the vaccine program in the UK, where you now have vaccines for children, even as the rest of the world is yet to receive a single dose. My own parents and grandparents can't get an mRNA booster. Here in India, that's considered the pharmaceutical industry of the world. And those vaccines are theft. They're stolen from the people of the global south because the UK government has consistently voted against a waiver of intellectual property protections that keep these vaccine recipes a secret. You think about something like food. 7 million people in the UK are struggling to afford to eat today. And it's a travesty that in a country as rich as the UK, 1 in 10 people struggle with hunger. But how do we contend with the demand for, say, a right to food in the UK when we know that the company that supplies UK farms with feed is Cargill, the multinational conglomerate that's responsible for absolutely destroying the Amazon rainforest, and in doing so, and has been doing so in near secrecy for decades. All this is to say, these things can't be second order questions. We can't fix the health system in the UK first and then look to build a just health system for the rest of the world. A very conception of an internationalist health project, for instance, has to take into account the fact that the UK holds and steals technological wealth from much of the global south and has been doing so for years. And this is important from where I'm sitting, because for me, it calls into question if there is such a thing as a shared national interest that unites, the British public or the public in the United States of America. Does it make sense to talk about the UK or the US as a subject of a socialist project if what we're looking for is who are the friends of the working classes in the UK, then it's the working classes in the rest of the world. It's also important, I think, strategically, when we look for locuses of power to attack. So, at a rally in Berlin, in Germany, we had farmers' movements from rural towns in Germany coming up and telling comrades of mine that we don't enjoy as much power in our country. So we're really looking to the farmers in India to set the agenda for building peasant power across the world. So just as, the fight against Uber is important, not just as a fight against Uber, the company, but for one that's representative of the struggle of precarious labor everywhere. Similarly, then, peasant organizations that aren't as strong as, say, other worker unions in much of the West. And that's for a multitude of reasons, but also because of the small numbers in which farmers make up the share of the national workforce. It means taking the farmers' movement in India seriously. One of the most decisive victories against neoliberalism in recent years, and in a country where farmers still make up a majority of the workforce and that hasn't completely capitulated to big agribusiness, and ask questions like, how can farmers in the UK, who are anxious about losing out, say, direct payments under the EU's Common Agricultural Policy in a post-Brexit world, what do they have in common with farmers in India struggling for and winning a battle for minimum support prices, and how farmers in India could be bolstered to drive that universal transnational battle for peasant power everywhere. So finally, on this, on this question of friends, I find the term unity that's been included in today's theme very interesting. How do people come together? Why do people come together and stay together? A couple of weeks ago, I was giving a talk in the US about internationalism, and a friend who was in the audience walked up to me afterwards and said, I agreed with everything you said, but I just couldn't do what you do because there's just too much sacrifice involved here. It's a Sisyphean task of fighting against the hegemon, and it's just so sad. And I think this painting of kind of struggles on the left as these grim and gray battles is one that's also fairly common in large parts of the world, when really, I think everyone on this call who's worked in any form of collective action groups, whether that's mutual aid, trade unions, other forms of collectives, would say that it's truly joyful to give up that kind of sense of self and trust in the community and have these political programs engage with real contradictions of life. That to me is the culture of collective action, which of course has been eroded again because of the destruction or weakening of trade unions in large parts of the country. But Guillermo Boulos, the Brazilian socialist politician, had this amazing term called the militancy of practical experience. He says the militancy that comes from people's practical experience is really what drives that joy. And of course, all of our comrade David Graeber used to talk about political pleasure. And I can only hope that all of us, whether it's through the explosion of the mutual aid phenomenon that happened in the UK, for instance, during the pandemic, or with the strengthening of trade unions that really set up hand washing stations and delivered food packets and communist-led governments like in Kerala and India, that we can continue to create this kind of political joy and enjoy it together. So it's really a delight for me to be able to speak at the May Day rally today, not least because the history of the communist movement in India is so closely tied to the history in Britain, ranging from India House, the building in Highgate in North London, is one of the birthplaces of Indian communism. But also the first ever bans on the Communist Party in India was led by the British government in 1934 so that it could extract resources without opposition to finance its war in Japan. So we have the story of plunder alongside the story of solidarity. And I think it's our project now to make solidarity more than a slogan and to make the ruling classes pay. Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, thank you so much. That was so interesting and inspiring. And I really like the focus on thinking about like collective joy and the kind of real sense of promise and hope we get from organizing with our comrades and winning those kind of small victories and the pleasure that it can bring. Right, so next off we've going to our speaker from the US. So we are joined today by Bhaskar Sunkara, who's the founding editor of Jacobin magazine, former vice chair of the DSA and author of the Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in an Era of Extreme Inequality. I hope I got that right. Thank you very much, Bhaskar.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to take part in the event. As some of you know, and obviously it's just introduced, I'm speaking here from the United States and not a place people always associate with May Day or with labor unrest, but it's actually one with a deep history and connection with the day. So not long after the Haymarket Massacre in Chicago, the first International Workers' Day was celebrated in 1886 with a general strike of 300,000 workers at 13,000 businesses across the United States. And since then, mostly not in the United States, May Day has been a day of class struggle and also celebration, a festival of solidarity and pride that working people should have in building the world anew each day. And this power of May Day, I think, comes from a simple idea that the workers of the world deserve more of the wealth that they create, that the people who have the knowledge to create these wonders deserve a real stake and say in shaping the society that's so indebted to them. It's the workers who build our cities. They deliver the things that ordinary people need. It's the workers, and I think the pandemic has driven this more clear than at any other point in recent memory, that they care for us when we're sick. And as Ronan said, they're celebrated with platitudes only and without the material security that they deserve. I think May Day means taking pride in work, taking pride in these efforts, dreaming of a world where work doesn't equal exploitation, and a renewed commitment to the struggle against oppression of every kind. But I think it's also a point of celebration. I think we can't cast the history of the workers' movement as just a history of defeat. The basic rights that we enjoy today, the rights that are now under siege, of course, but rights like universal suffrage, the creation of democracy, an 8-hour workday, basic safety and legislation. These are things that didn't exist before the advent of the workers' movement. The last 150 years hasn't been a history of defeat. It's been a history of qualified victory. And obviously, I don't need to tell you, like, unlike in the late 19th century, the United States today is not necessarily synonymous with labor struggle. But we've recently had an incredible breakthrough. Just earlier this month, Amazon workers here in New York achieved probably the most important labor victory in the US since the 1930s. I don't think that's an overstatement. The Amazon labor movement was an independent effort, a worker-led effort with literally no resources. I think one of their lead organizers, Chris Smalls, told me they had something like $30 in their bank account just a few weeks before their triumph. But they were able to take on one of the biggest companies in the world, just simply through organizing their coworkers, through talking with them, through showing them that they knew more about their lives and their struggles than their managers or than this giant corporation that promised them the world. Many of them didn't have much of a background on the political left, but they had the day-to-day experience of exploitation, of speed-ups, of automation, of mercurial managers, and they knew they had to act, and they knew they could relate to the thousands of coworkers that they work with every day. And by a fairly overwhelming number, despite millions of dollars spent to derail the campaign, workers voted to join a union. And it's just the start of efforts at Amazon. It's a reminder that as bleak as things seem, the contradiction between capital and labor will never go away. It's a contradiction that transcends generations. It's a contradiction that transcends communal differences of race or religious background, and it's the only basis of a working class politics. Our task now is to make the legacy of the workers' movement, our history and traditions, relevant to new generations. Young workers across Britain are doing that, and committed trade unionists at places like Amazon in the United States, like Starbucks and others, are a model for us. Politicians may disappoint us, present company excluded, of course. We might lose elections, but with an emphasis on our workplaces at the point of production and distribution, where workers already exercise power at scale, we'll have a bedrock of strength that won't go away to show millions that the struggle for the labor movement, the struggle that May Day is all about, is not apart from, but integral to the struggle for a better future for all people. And I think I'll just leave it at that, but I really do appreciate the invitation. It's inspiring to hear from all of you from so many different places, united in our common struggle.
Thank you very much, Bhaskar. Yeah, and I think it's important to kind of focus today, not just today, but all year round, actually, of where our power lies. And you're right, it is in our workplaces. We're not going to rely on politicians to come in and save us. We have to kind of leverage what we do have. Right, so now we're going from the US to our fellow socialists in Europe. So our next speaker is Txema Guijarro, the Spanish Congress member and General Secretary of the Podemos Parliamentary Group. Have we got?
Thank you very much, Daisy.
Thank you.
In fact, it's pronounced Guijarro, but I believe it's
I
kind of a difficult pronunciation. No problem. Thank you very much for the invitation, Arise in the Tribune. Of course, it's a pleasure to meet back old friends, Guillaume, Bhaskar, and of course, to learn from previous speakers. I think it's been really encouraging to hear previous interventions. Well, I'd like to start my intervention speaking about war, because as you know, and as we've heard previously, we're right now we're in a war context in Europe, which is something that, of course, influence all the context and all the political discussions that we are having these days. Of course, it's also time, I believe, to remember other peoples in the planet that are also fighting for their liberation, not only the Ukrainian people, of course, but also the Palestinian people, the people from Yemen, and also one of the peoples which I believe has been forgotten from a long time ago in the international community. That's the Western Sahara people, which fight right now a very difficult struggle against Morocco and against the European powers, including France and Spain, that will not support the rights for self-determination. But of course, coming back to the war in Europe and the war in Ukraine, it's obvious that the main victim will be the Ukrainian people and the Russian people, of course. But we, us in Europe, are going to pay also a very high price for this war. Of course, in economical terms, we've heard before the effects that we're suffering on prices and the inflation rates, which are accelerating, as you know, but also in the state budgets, where the military spending will rise, and therefore this means that social spending will very probable will fall, right? And that is something that we should take into account and we should fight, because all this militaristic moment that we're living is really, as I believe, not good for the working class people, of course, and not good for all the continent as a whole. I think that we should ask ourselves why have we reached this situation. There was a previous intervention, which of course I agree with, that mentioned the NATO policies and the US policies regarding this extension all through the eastern part of Europe. And that, of course, means that we should point out the causes that have led us to this situation. I believe that the worst thing that we can do in these moments is to buy this manichaeistic rhetoric or narrative that says that Putin is some kind of a maverick, a crazy guy, and don't understand the geopolitical reasons that are behind what's going on. I'd like to translate that lecture into my Spanish context, just so as to give you some picks. Of course, this war context that we're living has put a lot of tension within the Spanish government, where, as you know, we are participant as a minor partner with the Socialist Party. Unfortunately, the Socialist Party in Spain has embraced this militaristic rhetoric and will very much embrace itself in this high spending of militaristic and war spending, which is, as I say, something that will affect our social system, our health system, our educational system. And that's something that we need to denounce and to point out, because I believe that that is the main threat that we have right now for the unfolding of our progressive agenda in Spain. And I believe that the unfolding of that agenda is the only weapon that we have to face the uprise of fascism that we, of course, are also living in Spain. When I think about what we can see at the other side of the river, as we talk here in Spain, what we see is a right-wing main party, the so-called Partido Popular, which is willing to pact with fascism and is willing to take power along the main fascist party in Spain called Vox. Of course, the situation is absolutely critical. I believe that the international solidarity in these moments is more necessary than maybe it has been ever before, since we did not have a threat from fascism, as at least such a huge threat from fascism over these past 70 years. So I think it's time once more to unite, to call for the working class globally to resist, to recuperate our socialistic rhetoric, our socialistic objectives and goals, and to remember that all the peoples are living under that class struggle, and therefore what we are asking is that there should not be war among peoples, but war among classes, class struggle. So therefore, I'd like to end up this intervention, of course, thanking once more for the invitation to the organizers, but bringing back the old motto that we used to cry here in Spain 80 years ago, and which was "No pasarán." No pasarán, comrades. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining. So next off, sorry, I'm going through this quite quickly because I'm just conscious of time. So next off, we are being joined by Guillaume, so the former Ecuadorian foreign minister, who's going to talk about the advance of the left across Latin America.
Well, thank you very much for the invite. It's good to see so many friends online. I hope to see you all soon in person. I was going to follow on what Txema was saying, and a few of you before him also, and make a sort of use this May Day celebration to make a call for a politics of non-alignment. I really think this has to be one of the great causes of internationalism. Internationalists and activists such as us must really fight for this cause of non-alignment and the refusal of this new Cold War. It's pretty clear we are going into a Cold War, and the 21st century is going to be marked by deeply scarred by it. I think everybody will agree soon the Chinese economy will be the largest in the world. Whichever measure of GDP you take, it's only going to be a matter of a few years before China is the biggest economy in the world. And I think we can also all agree that the US is a very resilient global power. It still has a lot of resilience in it in all sorts of ways, economic, scientific, but also military, and it also has the capacity to align a number of its allies, particularly in Western Europe, but not exclusively in Western Europe, in order to be able to build a broad coalition and fight this Cold War. And so I think this Cold War is going to happen, and along with this Cold War, we'll see a return of all sorts of threats. Some of them we've discussed here on this call. Obviously, the most obvious one is the nuclear threat, but all sorts of other threats, such as a renewed arms race, we're already seeing appearing on the horizon. And of course, arms race means investment in the kinds of things that humanity doesn't need, and divestment, investment away from, pulling resources away from the urgent necessary resources that we need in order to be able to resolve our dire challenges, obviously climate change being the most, probably the most important one, but all sorts of social and economic challenges which we face as humanity and which we know are fundamental for peaceful living on this planet of ours. So these kinds of real consequences of a Cold War, which of course will affect, as usual, the most vulnerable sectors of society, the most vulnerable peoples of the world, are the kinds of things that we have to fight against and refuse. Now, there are also, fortunately, we have an experience. There is a legacy of non-alignment. There is a story of non-alignment, particularly, but not exclusively, in the global South. We have to salvage, rescue some of the most important achievements of non-alignment in the past, particularly the legacy after the Bandung Conference of '56, particularly of the late '60s and early '70s of the non-aligned movement, the G77, sort of fight for a new multilateralism that fights for a real global democracy. We need to relive a new, more climate-conscious, new international economic order, the famous NIEO, which is back in fashion. We need to really find new solutions that are part of this non-alignment battle for non-alignment, for a Green New Deal, financing to fight climate change, but for which includes sustainable development, etc., which is putting the issues back on the agenda that are non-aligned, that do not belong to this Manichaean idea of two sides of the world fighting each other, this Manichaean idea of Western democracy versus rogue states, and so on and so forth. There's so many expressions of this that we have to fight. Now, of course, this is primarily a task for the global South, but it is not exclusively a task from the global South. We can also, in the global North, you can also in Britain declare yourself non-aligned. After all, one of the founding members of the non-aligned movement was Yugoslavia, not a global power, but a country very much in the global North. And, you know, there are small things that countries have done that have signaled, hinted at non-aligned policies. You know, France left NATO in 1966 and didn't join it until 2009. I'm not suggesting France was a non-aligned movement, but there are a number of things that can go towards having a more non-aligned foreign policy that the left can fight for in the UK, in the world, and elsewhere. I think it is a task for activists, for internationalists, to refuse this new Cold War that is being imposed on us. I think it's very important for us to normalize this notion of non-alignment and to encourage also the politics of regionalism. I'm not going to have any time to go into this, but to encourage the surge of regional organizations in the global South. I'm working on the UNASUR and trying to relaunch the UNASUR right now, the Union of South American Nations, because these regional expressions of coalitions of states are also a way of creating a more multipolar world, which in itself goes to fight, is sort of a way of avoiding a bipolar world and therefore recreating this non-aligned movement and refusal of a Cold War. It is, of course, primarily the task of states. And maybe some of us here on this call will be governments one day, so it's something that we should bear in mind as we fight to become governments. But I still think it is also a responsibility of internationalists and activists to normalize this, to make this non-aligned cause a cause that is morally correct, morally right for the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining and for your really interesting intervention. I'm sure you've left everyone with a lot to think about there. Right, so next up, we are delighted to be joined by Diane Abbott MP, who I'm sure needs no introduction here. So Diane was Britain's first ever Black woman MP and is still today such a leader in the fight against racism and for international justice today. Thank you, Diane. Or you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're can you turn your camera on? The camera's gone off. Yeah, lovely, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming to this important event today. And I wanted to address, in the time I have, one particular issue, the issue of migrants and refugees. And there are a number of reasons that I wish to speak to that. One is we're seeing with some of the wars around the world, but also with climate change, increasing numbers of migrants trying to move to safety. And we're also seeing governments, right-wing governments around the world, using migration and immigration as issues to divide working people. There was an illustrious Labour socialist politician, Tony Benn, and he said this, quotes, "We should always watch how politicians treat refugees because that's how they would treat the rest of us if they thought they would get away with it," close quotes. Well, it seems outlandish, doesn't it, that any government would treat its own citizens the way the British government, for one, is currently treating refugees. As we know, the most recent statement about asylum seekers and refugees from the British government is they're going to dump them in East Africa, in Rwanda. Now, this is almost certainly in breach of international human rights. It's almost certainly immoral, as the Archbishop of Canterbury has said, and it's almost certainly an extraordinary way of dismissing people's human rights, but that's what they're saying. So you might say, I know things are bad, but isn't it an exaggeration to say we're all going to be shipped off to Rwanda? But I'm sorry to say that kind of brutal treatment of refugees and the rest of us isn't too much an exaggeration at all. We all know the vast number of individual tragedies, the Windrush scandal, which included large numbers of people who were unlawfully deported. Some of those people were actually born there. We've seen the new Nationality and Borders Bill in the UK, which threatens to do the same for millions of people in this country. Millions of people in this country, as a result of the new Nationalities and Borders Bill, will become second-class citizens in Britain and at risk of being deported. This government is adopting a send them back policy, which would have pleased that famous racist Enoch Powell. He was thrown out of the Tory party for this send them back policy, but this is what the Tories under Boris Johnson are currently adopting. But it goes even further than this. I want to explain how. Because sadly, there are some people on the left who refuse to see how an injury to one is an injury to all on the issue of migration. We need to see that standing up for migrants is important in terms of standing up for all of us. We had Brexit here in the UK. Some people were believed to worker shortages and therefore higher wages. We do have worker shortages, but only a third of that is EU workers that have left. Most of the people who've dropped out of work altogether are people that have come out of the workforce because wages are simply too low. In some cases, they literally can't afford to go to work. There's a surge of people in work, an unprecedented surge of people in work who are having to use food banks and get free food. Wages are not set by supply and demand, as some people seem to think. They're set by employers. And workers around the world have to struggle against employers to get fairness. The biggest employer in Britain is the government. They have cut wages, pensions, and working conditions. We have to struggle against that. Recently, there was an outrageous case of modern slavery exposed under the Season Agricultural Workers Scheme. Ukrainian workers have largely replaced EU seasonal workers who have gone home. But the net result is not higher wages for British workers, it is worse conditions for overseas workers. And they have no way of fighting for their rights because they're not citizens. So we have a race to the bottom. But the Home Office is doing everything it can on the one hand to stop Ukrainians coming here as refugees, but on the other hand to do nothing to force down wages and conditions for other migrants. So it's so important to stand up to the attacks on races and migrants. It's so important to stand up to the allegation that Labour MPs voted for illegal immigrants to stay, which is something the Tories are using in their posters and online campaigns. We have to argue for fairness and equity for asylum seekers, whatever part of the world they come from. We have to argue for pursuing our international human rights obligations to asylum seekers and refugees. And finally, I want to say this: unless we offer real solidarity and internationalism to workers all over the world, we will suffer an attack on every front. The moral outrage of simply dumping asylum seekers in Rwanda will go unanswered. The deportation of British citizens will become normalised under the Tories' new laws. Workers' rights will be undermined even further. And finally, Labour will be incapable of winning unless it answers these issues in a principled manner. Internationalism and solidarity are not just buzzwords. International and solidarity must be our practical policies. Only in that way will we support the human rights of workers all over the world, and only in that way will we move forward as a British Labour movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Diane. And yeah, you're absolutely right. The Labour Party needs to take a principled stance on immigration, on refugee policy. I mean, not only because it's the right thing to do, but also we're never going to win by trying to fight the Tories kind of on their own terms. We need to take a principled stance, supporting refugees firmly against the new Rwanda policy. Right, so next off, we are going to be joined by Jess Barnard. So Jess is the current chair of Young Labour and is also standing to be on the NEC. Throughout the last kind of 18 months, Jess has been an absolute inspiration in the Labour Party to all of us here. I'm sure you've all seen kind of the barrage of attacks that Young Labour have faced from our own party. And Jess has stood absolutely firm, kind of refused to back down and refused to stop supporting kind of socialist policies, and I think has been, inspired many of us in the party at the moment. So in the next couple of months, we'll be electing a new Young Labour committee and a Labour Students Committee. So I would encourage everyone here, if you are a member of the Labour Party at the moment, to make sure your CLPs are nominating the left candidates, just to ensure that we can carry on doing the fantastic work that Jess has started over the last couple of years. So thank you very much, Jess.
Thanks, Daisy. Thanks for such a lovely introduction. And also make sure you re-elect Daisy to the Young Labour National Committee if you have a vote, because she's been an incredible member on that committee. And I really look forward to seeing all the work continue over the coming years. You've heard some incredible messages of solidarity today, and I wanted to touch on some of the workers that I'm thinking of today, and particularly after the last few years that we've all been facing. And there are three people that stick in my mind when I was meeting people on the doorstep recently, and I wanted to think about them today. And so I'm thinking of the trainee nurses, and one in particular who I met, who talked about how they had cared for an unmanageable number of patients on their ward and found themselves on their feet for 12 hours at a time, unable to even take a break long enough to have a cup of tea without feeling guilt about abandoning their patients or putting more pressure on their colleagues, and up against an entirely impossible task. The level of stress that they were under, coming home crying each day. The same nurse who's on such low pay, they would then take on additional shifts cleaning those same wards to top up the pay, to have enough money to feed their family and heat their homes. And this is a nurse who, for the love of their work and caring for others, would get up day after day and face the COVID-19 crisis head on, while so many of us were able to be at home. And I'm thinking of them today. I'm thinking of teachers who were utterly abandoned by our government, left to navigate a completely unprecedented crisis, continuing to battle the dismantling of our education system, and then demonized by the Tory media machine in thanks for their work. And these teachers who, despite all of this, when our society falls short, so far short in delivering for our young people, they are the ones who are there, unwavering in their consistency for young people and their dedication to educating the future. And I'm also thinking of shop workers who worked around the clock, managing national shortages, complete lack of PPE, who were overwhelmingly exposed to the health crisis on low pay, and determined, though, to keep the public fed and cared for. The same workers who now find themselves forgotten, struggling against fiery hire tactics of big bosses who refuse to respect them and their terms and conditions of their contracts. And these are workers who deal with, some of us on our worst days, deal with terrible conditions, but are they incredibly proud of the essential work that they play in our everyday lives. And I think this is something that we can all share today, and that is, we are all proud of our working class roots, but we demand our worth, and that is that we have a fair and full life and that we are respected in the workplace. And I think it's important to remember, we know millions of us clapped on our doorsteps for these workers in acknowledgement of their courage and their labour, but it feels like we've come so far away from that now in a country where the cost of living is skyrocketing, and our government is refusing to pay workers a true living wage. And a gulf is opening up between the working class and those who don't just take us for granted, but are deliberately exploiting us for profit. So today, I think it's important we celebrate these workers and we remember the turmoil that workers have gone through. But it's so important that we pledge not just to stand shoulder to shoulder with workers, but to put our words into action. So if workers are unionizing against hostile employers, we need to be out there supporting them. If workers are taking industrial action or joining national campaigns, we need to be out there on the picket lines, standing with them physically. In Young Labour, we've pledged only to campaign for candidates who stand united with trade unions and with workers taking industrial action, because solidarity has to be the very basic minimum on which our movement is built. And we need to make sure we're doing so much more to build that, because I think for too long we have been licking our wounds and looking to someone to bring us out of this crisis and solve our problems. But if we are going to win back our rights as workers, if we're going to demand those rights, it's up to us to win the future, and we have to make that happen for ourselves. And I know you've heard from Nathália already about the struggle on the ground in Brazil, and I just wanted to touch on really briefly my time visiting Brazil last year. I met with friends and young workers and students from Brazil, from Chile, from Paraguay, from Venezuela, from Argentina, and hearing the experiences of all of these young workers and students and socialists and trade unionists, and seeing how determined they are that their future will be different and how serious they are about building international bridges was completely inspiring. And uniting with our friends in Australian Young Labour Left and YDSA against the AUKUS nuclear deal, we've been really heartened that across continents, young socialists share a vision of future of peace and anti-war and solidarity, and they are organising for that. And so I think it's important to remember today, our struggles are so far reaching. And I think that's really come through from listening to all the speeches today. I've been incredibly inspired by this. So there's so many lessons to learn from each other. There is solidarity to support each other. And there are movements there to inspire us to step up to the challenge we face. So solidarity and happy May Day.
Thank you so much, Jess. That was brilliant as usual. I just want to remind everyone here that Arise Festival is run by some amazing volunteers who've given up all their time, and these events do kind of cost them to put on. So there is a link to donate in the chat if anyone can spare a couple of quid to kind of support them and ensure that they can keep running these things in the future as well. That'd be fantastic. Right, so next I am going to pass over to Sarah Wooley. So Sarah is the General Secretary of the Bakers Union, who have been absolutely kind of fantastic in their support for working people, and are really kind of an inspiration about how unions are adapting and kind of increasing in hospitality, which many people saw for a while as kind of ununionizable and not areas that we can win, but their work has been kind of really groundbreaking there. So yeah, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you, and apologies, I'm sat in my car. I've been at Leeds May Day rally today, marching around Leeds and speaking, and I didn't have enough time to get home to talk to you. Not in my car, so I'm sat here in a car park getting all kinds of funny looks as people are walking past. I'm not going to talk for too long. There's been so many great speakers already today that have covered a vast amount of stuff, but I wanted to touch a bit on unity, solidarity and working together across the movement, and just how important that is. As I mentioned, I've been at the Leeds TUC May Day rally today with Richard, who I know, if he's not already spoken, won't be far off. And seeing people back together and talking about supporting each other's campaigns and disputes has really kind of got that fire back in my belly. It was really inspirational hearing and just getting back together and talking to each other. And there are so many disputes going on at the moment, and this might sound really silly to say, but it's really fantastic. It's fantastic to see workers and standing together and fighting back against bosses that are out of touch at best and downright exploitative at worst. And yes, it's not fantastic that those workers are being put in those positions, but the fact that it seems like we've turned a corner and so many more workers have got the confidence to stand up and say that they're not having it anymore and enough is enough and demanding better, it's just so much about what our movement is about. We need to ensure, though, that as a movement that we're supporting those workers, attending picket lines and demos, sending messages of support if we can't get there. But we've got to go further than that, haven't we? We've got to look at how we can work together better within an industry or a sector, but even across multiple sectors, because we've got to hit them where it hurts together collectively. We've got to work with organisations that sit within the movement but aren't trade unions. So I'm proudly wearing my DPAC t-shirt today, which is a fantastic example of that, because we've got to be coordinating action. That's going to be the difference between winning and creating change and having an impact or just being ignored. We've got to be better at working alongside each other and not competing for members in the same workplace, but strategizing together about how we tackle the Amazons of the world. You know, we've seen some fantastic achievements over in the USA and McDonald's, because the more that we come together, the more powerful we are. And I don't just mean standing on a platform or sitting in a car and speaking as I am at the minute. I mean actually putting that into practice, meeting as trade unions, strategizing together and getting feet on the ground. So moving forward, let's not concentrate on the things that we aren't aligned on. You know, we may not see eye to eye on how to tackle climate change, for example, but the whole movement does agree that workers should be paid a decent rate of pay, £15 an hour for the work that they do. So let's start there. Let's start at a multi-trade union campaign on the back of the march and demo in London on the 18th of June, talking about increasing pay for everybody, regardless of age and regardless of what they do. And then we build on that. We build on that together via solidarity and collectivism. And if you're watching this and you're not in a trade union, because, you know, people come about these videos there and every now and again. Join one, organise your workplace, organise your community. If you're in Leeds or in Sheffield, join Leeds Get Organised, or Sheffield needs a pay rise, and organise your communities, because we all deserve better. And as a good friend of mine said today on the platform when she spoke, we all deserve a decent life, and nobody's going to give that to us. We've got to do it together and get it ourselves. So solidarity. Thank you for the invitation, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the themes today for our rally is unity, and that's exactly what we need. We don't need trade unions and organisations in competition with each other. We need to be unified, and we need to be in solidarity and working together to have the biggest impact possible. So I'm just about to hand over to our final speaker. So just wanted to say again, thank you so much, everybody, for coming and participating at today's rally. I'm just going to pass over to Richard Burgon. Before I do that, I'm going to remind you again of the donation link that is in the chat, and the next Arise event on the Thursday, the 19th of May, which is in association with Labour Assembly Against Austerity. It's on the cost of living crisis. So thank you very much, everyone. And Richard, are you here with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Daisy, and a huge thank you to everyone that's taken part in this event today. Like Sarah, I've just come from the Leeds May Day rally, so I'll watch the speeches back later when I get a chance. I look forward to doing that. Congratulations to Arise and, of course, to Tribune for putting this event together. It's hugely important that on May Day we come together to celebrate workers in struggle in our country, but also workers in struggle around the world, because May Day is International Workers' Day. And as socialists and trade unionists, we're internationalists, and that's very important. And that's a subject that I'm going to return to later. It was back in 2004 that one of my heroes, Tony Benn, said that the historic task of the trade unions is to defend their members at work and seek stronger political representation in Parliament. And he was right. And those two tasks are more important than ever before. The industrial and the political, which of course are two sides of the same coin. And it's so clear, isn't it, when we see the bad bosses and what they're doing. And it's so clear as well when we see this dreadful government. You know, we need to take on exploitative employers and their government, because it is their government. This Conservative government is serving their interests, which is why they treat these employers, that treat working people like dirt. This government treats those employers with kid gloves. So we're meeting in a year in which we've marked in February the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Saltley Gate, a day that will live forever in the history of the trade union, workers and socialist movement. A day when, during a miners' strike, a national miners' strike, which the experts said could never be won, thousands and thousands of engineers in Birmingham came out, took secondary action, took direct action, and came to Saltley Gate fuel depot. And through their support, the gates of that fuel depot were closed, and the National Union of Mine Workers won that national dispute. And the spirit of Saltley Gate, I think, is alive and well, and we're seeing it in disputes around the country. There have been more instances of strike action than there have been for a number of years, and that's no surprise as we see the real attack on people's pay, terms and conditions. And there's so many examples to give, but one example I want to give is the strike by outsourced security guards at Great Ormond Street Hospital. I was on a rally there a few weeks ago, and the workers had taken 6 weeks of strike action in order to secure the same pay, terms and conditions as their NHS counterparts, also working as security guards. And that includes the same sick pay and the same maternity pay. Now, these companies and many companies around the country and lots of bosses, I think, sometimes think that workers like the security guards at Great Ormond Street Hospital, aren't the kind of workers that go on strike. People think that migrant workers, that predominantly female workforces, that Black and ethnic minority workers, people in powerful positions often presume that they aren't the kind of workers that go on strike. Well, the workers at Great Ormond Street Hospital, organised by the RWW and workers elsewhere, have proven those people wrong. Because not only are they taking strike action, they're actually leading the way in fighting back against exploitative pay terms and conditions, and at the same time actually striking a blow against NHS outsourcing and privatisation as well. Earlier this week, we also saw a great victory for Unite the Union at Trafford Park, where the workers there, the CHEP workers, have been on strike since December for 6 months and have won decent pay. They've won a fair pay settlement after 6 months, an incredibly difficult strike. And we've seen the UCU take strike action. I was very pleased in Leeds the other week to speak at a rally where UCU and Unison had coordinated action and support together. So workers are fighting back. And we see how necessary it is, don't we, when we see the abysmal spectacle at P&O, where we saw images of balaclavaed, handcuff-trained security guards being sent in to take workers off their ship as part of a plan to replace them with super exploited workers who, it was reported, were going to get paid as little as £1.80 an hour. It was like something from the Victorian age, or something like something from the United States, in fact, 120, 130 years ago, where bosses would send in thugs and goons to rough up striking workers and intimidate trade union members. And that's a situation we're living through. So we need to support trade union members and trade unionists who are fighting back. Politics and democracy isn't just about general elections. Obviously, general elections are vitally important, but politics doesn't happen just at every general election. The ballot box and parliamentary elections are a crucial part of democracy, but so is industrial action, so is strike action, so is protest action, so is direct action. And I think as socialists and trade unionists, we need to understand that the place of socialists is in every single struggle, whether that struggle be in parliament, in electoral politics, or whether that struggle be on the picket line, on the industrial dispute, or at the protest. And the Conservatives understand that politics and democracy are about the protest, about strike action, and about parliament as well. And that's why they're attacking all our ways of fighting back with their kind of flurry of anti-trade union laws over the years, making it harder and harder for trade unions to take strike action legally, or whether it be their introduction of voter ID in an attempt to suppress the working class vote, and in particular the Black and minority ethnic working class vote, or whether it be their draconian pushes to criminalise peaceful protest. So they're exercising class politics. And on May Day, on International Workers' Day, we need to exercise class politics too. And we can't have any defeatism. We've seen in the United States that workplaces that we've been told could never be unionised, Amazon and Starbucks, are being unionised. And that's in a country where socialism has been treated or used as if it's been a dirty word for maybe 60 or 70 years. Around the world, working people are fighting back and working people are winning. And so it's important that in Parliament, the trade union supporting MPs, Labour MPs, Left MPs speak up for workers' rights. I'm proud to be the secretary of the Social Campaign Group of Labour MPs, founded, amongst others, by Tony Benn over 40 years ago. It's founded to be the link, the buckle between the left in Parliament and fighting trade unions, social movements, and the wider social struggles. And that's what we need to be today. And that means organising in Parliament, in our unions, and in wider society for a programme to defend and lift living standards. That means, of course, a £15 an hour minimum wage. That means, of course, abolishing zero-hours contracts. It means, of course, abolishing fire in rehire. It means, of course, repealing the anti-trade union laws. It means, of course, introducing collective sectoral bargaining. It means, of course, ending the disgraceful situation where our country isn't even compliant with International Labour Organization standards when it comes to employment rights. That's a stain on our society, on our system. But of course, standing up for working people doesn't just mean the fundamentally important workers' rights, including, for example, full employment rights from day one. Working class people deserve the right to decent housing. So we need to be campaigning to build at least 100,000 new council houses every year. We need to be campaigning for better rights for tenants. We need to be campaigning for public services which aren't privatised, which do put the public good first. And if on May Day we're going to talk about standing up and building a mass movement for the working class, we need to understand as a movement what the working class is. Margaret Thatcher did a very good job of convincing working class people they weren't working class, that somehow they'd become middle class. And therefore what followed from that is that they didn't need collectivist solutions to the problems that they faced. They could deal with those things as individuals. So they didn't need to join a trade union. They didn't need to vote for the Labour Party. We need to understand as socialists that the working class are the majority in our society, not a minority in the way that Margaret Thatcher and some trendy journalists even today try to say. The working class is the majority in our society, who keep our society running, who create the wealth in our society, who keep our public services running. The working class is the diverse 99%. The working class is everyone who either has to work to make ends meet, or can't work because of disability, or can't work because they're looking for a job and can't find one. The working class is a majority in our society, and we need a majoritarian, popular programme to defend and lift living standards. And that just doesn't mean speaking up for workers in Parliament. That means supporting workers in struggle, supporting workers when they take on the bosses, supporting workers when they take on the horrendous agenda of this government. You know, that's what we've got to do. And I also want to make a point when we're considering what the working class is, it's the diverse majority, that class is an economic principle. Class isn't cultural. Whatever commentators say, class isn't about your accent, class isn't about what drinks you drink, or what words you use, or what football team you support. Class is not cultural. Class is about your economic position in society. So we need to be clear that the working class is the diverse majority, because as sure as night follows day, as working class communities face the biggest squeeze, the biggest attack on their living standards in living memory, those at the top, right-wing politicians and right-wing journalists in the media will seek to scapegoat. Sadly, we're going to see more racism from the top. We're going to see more scapegoating from the top. People are working class, regardless of the colour of their skin, regardless of where they're born, and regardless of whether they work in an office, in a call centre, in a factory, or in any other workplace. So we must totally reject and campaign against the scapegoating of migrants and minorities, which is about dividing the working class, and is about trying to let those at the top get away with once again making the working class majority pay the price for a crisis they didn't cause. We can't let them get away with it. We can't let them do what they did after the banking crisis, which was make the working class pay for a crisis they didn't cause. They even used the COVID crisis to enrich their corporate friends and to wage war on pay terms and conditions. And we can't allow them to do that during this cost of living crisis. So we need to support workers who are fighting back. And we're seeing that, aren't we? We're seeing fighting trade unionism. We're seeing a resurgence of trade unionism. That's so important. And we need to see more of that. And we need our politicians in Parliament to support workers taking on bad bosses and taking on this government. Because if we don't support workers in struggle, then all we're doing, in fact, is bemoaning the current parlous state of affairs, identifying what's wrong, but not supporting those who wish to do something about it. People across our society have had enough of being treated like dirt by this lying, out of touch elite government. The trade union movement, the workers' movement is the crucial way of fighting back against that and fighting back against that now. So we've all got a job to do. It's a moral responsibility of us all to try and build the biggest fighting trade union movement possible. It's never been in our history more important. It's never been more important. And I want to end on some more words from one of my heroes, Tony Benn, who said, and I think this is crucial when we think on May Day about our task, not just today, but each and every single day. He said that our job isn't just to manage capitalism. Our job is to change society and to define its finer values. That's what we need to do as a movement. The labour and trade union movement, united, the left in Parliament, the left in our fighting trade unions, the left in wider social movements like Black Lives Matter and the movements against climate catastrophe. We all need to unite more than ever before and take the fight to those who never stopped practicing class politics, the Conservatives and their corporate friends, the billionaires who've made the British billionaires that have increased their wealth to the tune of £270 million per day. They never stopped practicing class politics on behalf of the 1%. Now is the time for us as a trade union and labour movement to practice class politics, organised class politics, on behalf of the 99%. Let's make that our May Day vow and let's carry it out each and every single day until we build that better, more just, fairer society with a diverse working class majority, get the share they deserve of the wealth they create. Thank you.